Thomas Jacobsen woke with a start, drenched in sweat despite the February chill that seeped through his bedroom window. The dream again. Molten metal cascading like water, bright orange rivulets streaming across the foundry floor toward him, rising up his legs, his torso, until he couldn't breathe. He sat up, reaching instinctively for the glass of water on his nightstand, gulping it down in 3 long swallows. The digital clock read 4:17 a.m., 43 minutes before his alarm. No point trying to sleep now. Outside, Danville was still dark, the streetlights casting amber pools on patches of dirty snow. Thomas's breath fogged the kitchen window as he waited for his coffee to brew. 26 years at the General Motors foundry had trained his body to wake early, to prepare for the heat and noise and weight of the day ahead. Not even Sundays could break the habit. Especially not today, Sunday, February 22, 1998, the day before the meeting. Everyone at the plant knew something was coming. Management types from Detroit had been walking the floor all week, clipboards in hand, faces carefully blank. They never made eye contact, never responded to jokes or questions, just watched, wrote things down, whispered to each other. The rumors had been swirling for months, but something about those visitors made it real. Tomorrow at 2:00 p.m., all 3 shifts would gather in the cafeteria for an announcement. "You coming back to bed?" Olivia's voice was husky with sleep. She stood in the kitchen doorway, her gray-streaked hair loose around her shoulders, wrapped in the faded blue robe he'd given her for Christmas in '83. Couldn't sleep. Thomas poured coffee into his GM mug, the one they'd handed out for the plant's 25th anniversary, a keepsake now stained by thousands of refills. Thinking about tomorrow. "Come here." She held out her arms and he set down his coffee to accept her embrace. Her body was warm, familiar. They'd been married 28 years, longer than he'd worked at the foundry. Her heartbeat against his chest was steady, reliable. "Whatever they say tomorrow, we'll figure it out." Thomas nodded against her hair, breathing in the faint scent of the lavender shampoo she used. He wanted to believe her, but the truth hung between them, unspoken. GM was the largest employer in Vermilion County. It had been since 1945 when they'd converted the old World War II manufacturing plant into a foundry. Over 2,000 jobs, good union jobs with benefits, pensions, jobs that had built Danville's middle class, funded its schools, filled its churches and baseball fields and shopping centers. And now those Detroit men with their clipboards were walking through, taking notes, looking at machinery like it was already scrap metal, looking at men like they were already ghosts. "Dad. You're up early." Their son Tim stood in the hallway, 17 and lanky, hair still mussed from sleep. He'd grown 3 inches in the past year, shooting up past Thomas's own 6 feet. The boy had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's build. A 3rd-generation foundry man if things had gone according to plan. "Just getting an early start," Thomas said, separating from Olivia. "You hungry? I could make pancakes." "Sure." Tim slumped into a kitchen chair. "Is it about the meeting tomorrow? Jason's dad says they're closing the place down." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Jason's father worked in accounting, always had the inside scoop before the floor men heard anything. "We don't know that yet," he said, more sharply than he intended. "Nothing's decided until it's announced." Olivia squeezed his shoulder as she moved past him to get the pancake mix from the cupboard. A gesture of solidarity but also a warning, "Don't take it out on Tim." "Your father's right," she said. "No use speculating, we'll know tomorrow." Thomas stared out the window at the pre-dawn darkness. 26 years. He'd been 19 when he started at the foundry, fresh out of high school, following his father's footsteps. The old man had worked there for 32 years before retiring with a full pension and a gold watch. Thomas had been on track for the same. 2 more years and he'd hit his 30. That had been the plan. Make it to 30, then maybe look at something less demanding, something that wouldn't leave him with burns on his arms and metal dust in his lungs. Something that would let him stand straight at the end of the day without the constant ache in his lower back and shoulders. He'd endured for a purpose, security, a steady paycheck. Health insurance for Olivia when she'd had that breast cancer scare in '92. College fund contributions for Tim, mortgage payments on their modest 3-bedroom ranch on Woodlawn Avenue. A new Chevy every 5 years with his employee discount. "You're burning the coffee," Olivia said gently. Thomas blinked, realizing the pot had been sitting on the burner too long. The smell had turned acrid, just like his thoughts. The parking lot at First Presbyterian was full. Thomas had to park the Caprice around the corner on Gilbert Street. It seemed like half of Danville was trying to find reassurance in church this morning. Inside, he spotted at least 30 other foundry workers and their families. They nodded to each other, somber, like mourners at a funeral where the body hadn't been buried yet. Pastor Wilson must have sensed the mood. His sermon was about faith during trials, about the Israelites wandering in the desert, still believing in the promised land. Thomas tried to focus on the words, but his mind kept drifting to tomorrow's meeting, to the rumors, to the numbers. He'd read in the commercial news last month that GM had closed 3 other foundries since 1987. Saginaw, Michigan, Massena, New York. Central Foundry in Danville was supposed to be different. They'd modernized in '89, installed new equipment. They made crucial engine components. They'd been profitable as recently as last year, but then came NAFTA in '93, then the new emissions standards, then the talk of a foundry in Mexico that could do what they did for half the labor cost. And suddenly, the modernization that was supposed to secure their future for decades seemed like just a stopgap, a way to extract a few more years of productivity before pulling the plug. "Let us pray," Pastor Wilson said, and Thomas bowed his head automatically, but the words washed over him unheard. His own prayer was simpler, more desperate. "Please, God, not yet, I'm not ready." After the service, people clustered in small groups in the fellowship hall. Coffee and donuts sat mostly untouched on folding tables. The conversation was subdued, nervous laughter punctuating theories about what tomorrow would bring. Tom, Frank Reeves, who worked second shift in pouring, clapped him on the shoulder. "What have you heard?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing solid, you." "My cousin in human resources says they're moving everything to Mexico." Frank's voice dropped. "Says they've been planning it for 2 years. All that talk about modernizing was just to keep us quiet while they built the new place down south." "That's just a rumor," Thomas said, but even to his own ears, his denial sounded hollow. "My brother-in-law works at Hister," said Dave Mathers, who drifted over with his coffee. "They laid off 200 people last month, no warning, just pink slips on a Tuesday." Thomas nodded. Hister, the forklift manufacturer, had been Danville's other industrial anchor. Their recent cuts had sent a chill through the entire community. "At least we're getting a meeting," said Frank. "That's something." "Unless they're just gathering us all in one place to hand out the paperwork," Dave countered. "Easier than tracking everyone down." Thomas excused himself, suddenly needing fresh air. Outside, the February sun was bright but distant, offering light without warmth. Across the street, Bresci Tower, once the First National Bank building, Danville's proudest architectural achievement, stood 15 stories tall against the winter sky. When Thomas was a boy, his father had pointed to it and said that's how you know a town is doing well, when it builds up instead of out. Now the upper floors were vacant, had been for years. The newspaper said they couldn't find tenants. Another sign Thomas had been trying not to see. "Dad," Tim had followed him outside, "you okay?" Thomas forced a smile. "Fine, just needed some air." Tim scuffed his sneaker against the sidewalk. "If the plant closes, what happens to my college money?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Tim was supposed to start at University of Illinois in September. His grades were good, he'd already been accepted. The college fund had enough for the first year, maybe part of the second. The rest was supposed to come from Thomas's ongoing salary. "Don't worry about that," Thomas said automatically. "We've got it covered." But Tim was old enough to see through the reassurance. "Mom says you haven't even updated your resume since 1972. Thomas winced. It was true, he'd never needed to. The foundry had been as solid as the iron they poured. That's what his father had told him on his first day. "You stick with GM, son, and they'll stick with you." "I'm gonna figure something out," he told Tim. "Your education is the priority, no matter what." Tim looked like he wanted to say more, but Olivia appeared at the church door, gesturing for them. "Pastor's asking for all the GM families," she said. "He wants to say a special prayer." Thomas followed his wife back inside, his son beside him. A special prayer, like they were already casualties. He straightened his shoulders, suddenly angry. He wasn't dead yet, the plant wasn't closed yet. There was still tomorrow. Monday morning arrived with fresh snow and bitter wind. Thomas left for work at 5:30 a.m., same as always, the Caprice's headlights cutting through darkness and flurries. The radio was playing My Heart Will Go On, that song from the Titanic movie that Tim had taken a girl to see twice now. Thomas snapped it off. He didn't need the irony. The foundry smokestacks loomed against the pre-dawn sky, 3 massive columns belching steam into the cold air. On a normal day, Thomas took their output for granted, just part of Danville's industrial backdrop. Today, he found himself studying them, wondering how much longer they'd stand. Security waved him through the gate and he parked in his usual spot, row C, halfway between the entrance and the maintenance shed. His space claimed by habit over decades. Other cars were pulling in around him, headlights sweeping across dirty snow, men in heavy coats, lunch pails in hand, trudging toward the time clocks. The scene could have been from any Monday over the past 26 years, except for the tension. It hung in the air, visible in hunched shoulders and averted gazes. No one lingered to chat, no one slapped backs or exchanged weekend stories. They moved like automatons, punching in, donning protective gear, taking their stations. Thomas's job was in core assembly, where the sand molds were prepared for casting engine blocks. His workstation was the same one he'd had for 15 years. Third position on line B, responsible for setting the cores that would create the internal channels for oil circulation in the finished block. It was precision work that machines still couldn't do as reliably as experienced hands. As he began his shift, Thomas found himself noticing details he usually filtered out. The way vibration from the conveyor belts traveled up through the concrete floor and into his boots. The smell, hot metal, machine oil, sweat, the chemical tang of the binding agents used in the sand cores. The sound, a constant mechanical symphony of clanks, hisses, rumbles that he normally didn't even hear anymore, but today seemed almost deafening. "They're closing it down," said Ernie Davis, who worked the station next to Thomas's. He had to lean in close to be heard over the machinery. "My cousin works security, says they've got the paperwork all drawn up." Thomas didn't respond, focused on setting a core precisely in its mold. His hands knew the work even when his mind was elsewhere. "You listening, Tom? I said they're shutting us down today." "I heard you," Thomas said finally, "and I heard the same thing when they were talking about closing Saginaw and Massena." "Rumors, Ernie. This ain't a rumor, this is from inside." "We'll find out at 2, Thomas said, ending the conversation. But as the morning wore on, the rumors multiplied. Someone had seen U-Haul trucks behind the administrative offices. Someone else had a friend in purchasing who'd been told to cancel all orders for materials beyond March. A cousin's wife's brother had heard from a GM executive in Detroit that Danville was considered structurally obsolete despite the modernization. By lunch, the cafeteria was a knot of nervous energy. Men talked in hushed voices, clustered by department. Thomas sat with his usual group, Ernie, Frank from second shift who'd come in early for the meeting, Ray Sullivan from quality control, and Pedro Vasquez from shipping. "My wife says I should ask about early retirement," Ray said, poking at his meatloaf without eating it. "I've got 28 years in, maybe they'll offer packages." "Packages?" Ernie snorted. "You mean payoffs to go quietly." "Better than nothing," Ray countered. "I'm at 26, Thomas said, 2 years short of 30. You think they care about that? You think they'll say, oh wait, let's keep it open 2 more years so Jacobsen can get his full pension?" The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. The others looked at him, then down at their trays. "Sorry," Thomas muttered, "I didn't sleep much." "None of us did," Pedro said softly. At 42, he was the youngest at the table with 3 kids still at home. "I was up all night looking at the classifieds, not much out there." Thomas nodded. Pedro had come to Danville in '86 specifically for the foundry job. He'd bought a house just 3 blocks from Thomas, fixed it up himself. Their wives were in the same book club, their kids had gone to school together. Now Pedro was scanning classifieds for jobs that didn't exist. "There's Quaker Oats in Danville," Frank offered. "And the VA hospital is always hiring." "For what?" Ernie demanded. You think they need people to pour iron there? You think they're looking for guys with foundry skills? We're specialized, man. That's what they told us was our value. Our expertise, now it's a liability. Thomas pushed away from the table. I'm going to get some air before the meeting. Outside, he leaned against the brick wall, watching his breath form clouds in the February air. Across the parking lot, he could see the administrative wing where the suits from Detroit would be preparing their announcement, probably rehearsing their somber expressions, their regretful tones. Their assurances that this was a business decision, nothing personal, just the realities of the global marketplace. He'd given this place his youth, his strength, the carpal tunnel in both wrists. The hearing loss in his left ear from years before proper protection was mandated, the back pain that kept him up some nights, the skin grafts on his right forearm from a splash of molten metal in '84. He'd given them his health, his time, his loyalty, and now they would give him what? A packet of papers, a few months of severance if he was lucky. The 1:30 bell rang, calling workers to begin gathering in the cafeteria. Thomas pushed off from the wall, straightening his spine, rolling his shoulders back. Whatever was coming, he'd face it standing tall. He had that much pride left. The cafeteria was packed by 150, 3 shifts worth of employees, over 500 people, crammed into a space designed for 200. Men stood along the walls, sat on tables, squeezed together on benches. The noise was deafening, hundreds of conversations, the scrape of chairs, the occasional nervous laugh. At precisely 2:00, Charles Embry, the plant manager, stepped onto a makeshift platform at the front of the room. Beside him stood 3 men in suits that cost more than Thomas made in a month. One held a stack of papers. The room fell silent so quickly it was as if someone had thrown a switch. "Thank you all for coming," Embry began, his voice amplified by a portable PA system that distorted his words slightly. "As you know, General Motors has been undergoing a period of strategic realignment across all divisions." Thomas felt his stomach clench. Corporate speak, never a good sign. After extensive analysis and consideration, the decision has been made to cease operations at the Central Foundry Division in Danville, effective June 30, 1998. A collective intake of breath, like a single organism being wounded. Then murmurs growing louder. Embry held up his hands. "Please let me finish. Every employee will receive a minimum of 4 months severance based on years of service. Health benefits will continue for 6 months after closure. The company will provide job placement services, including resume assistance and retraining options through local community colleges." The words washed over Thomas like water, meaningful but impossible to grasp. June 30th. 4 months from now, the end of everything he'd built his life around. One of the Detroit suits stepped forward, a woman with sharp features and a practiced expression of concern. "We understand this is difficult news," she said. "GM has valued the contributions of the Danville foundry for over 50 years. This decision was not made lightly, but market conditions and global competition have created a situation where continuing operations here is no longer viable." "What about the modernization?" someone called out. "We spent millions upgrading in '89. The woman's expression didn't change. "Those improvements extended the life of this facility by nearly a decade, but technology continues to advance and newer facilities offer significant cost advantages." "You mean cheaper labor in Mexico?" another voice shouted. Now Embry stepped forward again. "We have information packets for everyone which outline the transition timeline, severance details, and resources available to you. Department managers will be meeting with each of you individually over the next 2 weeks to discuss your specific situation." Thomas sat very still, aware of the men around him shifting, muttering, some standing to leave. Frank had his head in his hands. Pedro was staring straight ahead, his face blank. Ernie was on his feet, red-faced, shouting something that was lost in the growing noise. Someone thrust a blue folder into Thomas's hands. He opened it mechanically, seeing but not comprehending the pages inside. Numbers, dates, phone numbers for the employee transition team. A glossy brochure titled "Your Next Chapter, Resources for Career Transition." His next chapter. As if his life were a book someone else was writing. "The union reps sold us out," Ray was saying beside him. "They knew this was coming, had to." Thomas closed the folder and stood up. He needed to get out, needed air. The cafeteria felt suddenly too hot, too close. He pushed through the crowd, past men who looked shell-shocked, past others who were openly weeping, past anger and disbelief and the first tendrils of fear. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. June 30th, 4 months, then what? At 45, with no college degree, with skills specific to a dying industry, what was he supposed to do? Tom. It was Charles Embry, the plant manager, stepping out of the cafeteria. I wanted to catch you. Can we talk? Thomas straightened, wary. He and Embry weren't friends, but they'd worked together for years, had a professional respect for each other. What's left to say? Thomas asked. Embry glanced around, then lowered his voice. I fought this, Tom. For 2 years I've been showing them numbers, making the case for keeping Danville open, but the decision came from the top, way above my head. Did you know when they did the modernization that this was the plan? Squeeze another decade out of us, then cut and run. Embry looked pained. It wasn't like that. The industry's changing. Casting technologies, emission standards, global competition. Save it for the press release, Thomas cut him off. I've got 26 years in, 2 years short of full retirement. What happens to my pension? You'll be vested in what you've earned, Embry said. It'll be reduced, of course, proportional to your years of service versus the 30-year benchmark. But you won't lose it entirely. Reduced, Thomas laughed, a harsh sound. By how much? I don't have the exact figures, Embry admitted. HR will meet with everyone individually to go over the specifics. Thomas turned to go, but Embry caught his arm. Tom, listen, there's something else. The decommissioning team needs experienced people to stay on past June, help dismantle equipment, supervise the shutdown. It would be another 6 months of work at your current salary plus a completion bonus. I put your name on the list. The offer hung in the air between them, 6 more months, half a year of paychecks he hadn't been counting on, time to figure out what came next. Who else is on this list? Thomas asked. We need about 50 people. I'm talking to the most experienced first. And then what? We turn out the lights and lock the door behind us. Embry nodded, not meeting his eyes. Something like that. Thomas thought of his mortgage, of Tim's college tuition, of the bills that would keep coming whether the foundry was open or not. 6 months of salary would help. The bonus, whatever it was, might make a real difference, but something inside him rebelled at the thought. They wanted him to help dismantle his own livelihood. To carefully take apart the machines he'd spent his life mastering, to sweep up the ashes after they burned down his house. I'll think about it, he said finally, and walked away, the blue folder heavy in his hand. The parking lot was chaos, men standing in groups, gesturing angrily, others sitting alone in their cars, staring through windshields. A few had already left, tires spinning on the slush-covered pavement in their hurry to be gone. Thomas moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, acknowledging nods with nods, avoiding conversations. He reached his caprice and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, staring at the foundry through the windshield. The massive brick buildings, the tall smokestacks still belching steam, the high windows that glowed orange at night when they were pouring iron. It had seemed so permanent, a fixture like the courthouse downtown or the Vermilion River. Something that would always be there. He'd been 19 when he started, fresh out of high school. His father had worked the midnight shift for 32 years, coming home each morning with iron dust embedded in the creases of his hands. Good honest work, he'd called it, the kind that builds something real. Thomas had planned to go to college, had decent grades, had even been accepted to Illinois State, but the summer after graduation, Olivia had gotten pregnant. They'd married quickly, and his college plans had been set aside. His father had spoken to the personnel manager, and Thomas had started at the foundry the following Monday. Temporary, he'd told himself, just until they got on their feet, but the work was steady, the paycheck dependable. The benefits good, and then Tim was born and they needed a bigger apartment, then a house, then a second car, then braces for Tim and repairs for the roof and a new furnace. Life had accumulated around him like sediment, layer by layer, until the idea of doing anything else seemed impossible. Now he had 4 months, or 10 if he took Embry's offer to stay for the decommissioning. And then what? He started the car, the familiar rumble of the engine oddly comforting. He'd need to tell Olivia. She'd been expecting this, had been more realistic than him about the rumors, but expecting bad news and receiving it were different things. As he pulled out of the parking lot, Thomas found himself taking a different route home, driving past Danville High School. It was just letting out, teenagers spilling onto sidewalks, laughing, pushing, full of energy and promise. Had he ever been that young, that unknowing? He continued downtown, past storefronts that hadn't changed much since his own youth. Miller's department store where his mother had bought his school clothes each August. The Fisher Theater where he'd taken Olivia on their first date to see The Godfather. Palmer Bank, where they'd secured their mortgage in '81, the loan officer congratulating Thomas on his solid employment at GM. But there were changes too, ones he'd been noting peripherally for years but now saw with painful clarity. Vacant storefronts where local businesses had once thrived, for lease signs in dusty windows. The old Walgreens replaced by a discount store selling irregular merchandise. The slow erosion of prosperity, happening right in front of him while he'd been focused on his own secure world at the foundry. He turned onto Gilbert Street, passing First Presbyterian, then onto Woodlawn Avenue. Their house sat mid-block, a modest ranch with aluminum siding they'd painted forest green 5 years ago. The driveway needed shoveling. Another task he'd have plenty of time for soon enough. Olivia's car was already in the driveway. Of course, she'd have left the kindergarten where she taught as soon as school let out, rushing home to wait for news. He pulled in behind her and sat for a moment, gathering himself. Then he took the blue folder from the passenger seat, tucked it under his arm, and went inside to tell his wife that the foundation their lives had been built on was crumbling beneath them. She was waiting in the kitchen, still in her teaching clothes, a floral print dress and cardigan, her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head. One look at his face and she knew. "They're closing it," she said, not a question. Thomas nodded, setting the blue folder on the table between them. June 30th. Olivia sank into a chair. "I hoped the rumors were wrong, that it would be a partial layoff or a temporary shutdown, or," she trailed off, then reached for his hand across the table. "I'm so sorry, Tom." He squeezed her fingers, grateful for her warmth. "Embry offered me a spot on the decommissioning team, 6 more months after closing, plus some kind of bonus at the end." "That's something," she said. "More time to figure things out." "To dismantle everything I've helped build for 26 years, he said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "To train whatever poor bastards they've got lined up in Mexico to do our jobs for a quarter of the pay." "Did they say that's where the work is going?" "Mexico." Thomas shrugged, "Not officially, but everyone knows. They've been building a new foundry in Saltillo, state of the art. Why modernize here if they were just going to shut us down? It was all part of the plan." Olivia was quiet for a moment, absently tracing patterns on the back of his hand with her thumb. It was a familiar gesture, one that had calmed him through countless stresses over their marriage. "What about your pension?" she asked finally. "Reduced." "I don't know by how much yet. We'll have meetings with HR to go over the details." "And health insurance?" "They'll cover us for 6 months after closing. After that, we're on our own." She nodded, processing this. Always practical, his Olivia. While he was still reeling from the emotional impact, she was already calculating numbers, considering options. And severance. 4 months minimum, they said. "More based on years of service," he gestured to the folder. "It's all in there, supposedly. I haven't looked at it closely." She reached for the folder, but he put his hand on it. "Not yet," he said. "I can't. I need a minute." "Of course." She stood, came around the table, and put her arms around him. He leaned his head against her middle, breathing in her familiar scent, chalk dust, and the lavender hand lotion she used to combat the dryness caused by constant hand-washing in her kindergarten classroom. "We'll be okay," she murmured, stroking his hair. "We've got savings, my job is secure, the house is almost paid off, we'll figure this out." Thomas wanted to believe her, wanted to find comfort in her certainty. But a lifetime of identity wrapped up in his work at the foundry couldn't be untangled with a few reassuring words. Who was he if not a foundry man? What value did he have if not the ability to support his family with the skilled labor of his hands? "What am I going to do?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. It wasn't just about finding another job, it was more fundamental than that. What am I going to be? Olivia pulled back slightly to look at him, her hands on his shoulders. "You're going to be who you've always been, Thomas Jacobsen, a good man, a good husband. A good father, the rest we'll figure out one day at a time." The front door opened and Tim's voice called out, "Mom, Dad, you home?" Thomas straightened, quickly wiping his eyes. He didn't want his son to see him broken. "In the kitchen," he called back, his voice steady enough. Tim appeared in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He took in the scene, his parents' clothes together, the blue folder on the table, the uncharacteristic stillness of the house at this hour when his father should have been at work. "They're closing it, aren't they?" he asked, his young face solemn. Thomas nodded. "End of June." Tim set his backpack down and came to the table. "So what happens now?" "Now we have dinner," Olivia said, her teacher's voice taking over, practical and no-nonsense. "Then we'll go through this folder together and see what we're dealing with. Then we'll make a plan." Thomas looked at his wife, then at his son. They were both watching him, waiting for his reaction, taking their cues from him. He was still the head of this family, job or no job. He stood up straighter. "Your mother's right," he said. "We take this one step at a time." He reached for the folder, opened it, forced himself to look at the first page. A letter from the CEO of General Motors expressing regret, thanking employees for their service, explaining market forces and global competition, corporate condolences. He flipped past it to the severance details. Based on his years of service, he'd receive 6 months of pay, distributed bi-weekly just like his regular paychecks. Health coverage for 6 months, a lump sum payment for unused vacation time. Access to career counseling services through a firm in Champaign, a hotline number for questions, 6-month severance, he said, plus another 6 if I stay for decommissioning. That's a year of paychecks to figure out what's next. "And I'll be working," Olivia said. "My salary's not as much, but it covers the basic bills." "And I can get a job," Tim added. "I've been thinking about it anyway, maybe at County Market or something, for spending money at college." Thomas looked at his son, a wave of complicated emotions washing over him. Pride in Tim's willingness to help, shame that it might be necessary, determination that it wouldn't be. "No," he said firmly. "You focus on finishing senior year strong, getting ready for Illinois, that's your job." "Dad, I mean it, Tim. We're not that desperate." He turned to the next page in the folder, which outlined the pension adjustments. His monthly benefit would be reduced by 40% from what it would have been at 30 years. It was still something, about $1,200 a month once he turned 62, but not the comfortable retirement cushion he'd been counting on. Olivia read over his shoulder, her hand on his back. "We can work with this," she said. "It's not what we planned, but it's not nothing." Thomas nodded, trying to see it through her eyes. Not catastrophic, just a severe course correction. They still had their health, their home, each other. "I should call my folks," he said suddenly. His parents had retired to Florida 5 years ago, but his father still identified strongly with the foundry. This news would hit him hard. "And we should let your sister know." Olivia nodded. "I'll start dinner. We've got that casserole I was saving for tomorrow, but I think tonight calls for comfort food." Tim was still standing awkwardly by the table. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. Thomas looked at his son, tall, strong, smart. Everything he'd worked for, standing right there. "You could shovel the driveway before it freezes solid," he said, "then maybe help your mother with dinner." Tim nodded, clearly relieved to have a concrete task. He headed to the hall closet for his coat. Left alone in the kitchen, Thomas closed the folder. The details would still be there later. Right now, he needed a moment to process not just the facts but the feeling, the vertigo of having the ground shift beneath him, the strange sense of both burden and liberation. The fear, yes, but also something else, a questioning that had been dormant for years, now awakening. What else could he be? What else might his life become? He wouldn't have chosen this disruption. But now that it had arrived, forcing change upon him, a small, quiet voice inside wondered if perhaps there was an opportunity hidden within the crisis. The next 3 days passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings. Thomas met with his HR representative, a nervous young woman named Jennifer who had been at the foundry less than a year. She walked him through the severance package in detail, explained the process for applying for unemployment benefits when the time came, offered brochures about retraining programs at Danville Area Community College. The company will cover tuition for up to 2 years of vocational training, she told him, sliding another glossy brochure across her desk. Many of our employees are considering new careers in healthcare, information technology, or transportation. Thomas nodded, trying to picture himself as a nurse or a computer technician or a truck driver. None of it felt real. And have you decided about the decommissioning team? Jennifer asked. Mr. Embry mentioned he'd spoken to you about it. I'm still considering it, Thomas said. The truth was he'd been avoiding the decision, torn between practical need and emotional resistance. We'll need your answer by next week, she said. The positions are limited and there's significant interest. Of course there was. Everyone was scrambling for whatever lifeline they could grab. After the HR meeting, Thomas walked the floor of the foundry, observing operations with new eyes. The massive pouring vessels that tipped molten iron into molds. The cooling conveyors. The shakeout stations where solidified castings were separated from sand. The finishing areas where rough edges were ground smooth. Every station, every machine, every process familiar to him from decades of daily exposure. Men nodded to him as he passed, some offering grim smiles, others avoiding eye contact. The camaraderie that had defined the workplace for so long was already fraying, replaced by individual worry, everyone wondering. What will I do next? Where will I go? How will I provide? In the break room, the bulletin board was covered with new notices, job fairs in Champaign and Terre Haute, information sessions about benefits, sign-up sheets for resume workshops, and a large calendar counting down the days until June 30th, someone having taken a red marker to cross out February 23rd, the day of the announcement, with angry slashes. Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at an empty table. Closing his eyes, he let the ambient sounds of the foundry wash over him, the rhythmic thud of the stamping machines, the hiss of pneumatic tools. The rumble of forklifts moving materials, sounds that had been the backdrop of his working life for so long that he rarely noticed them anymore. Soon they would fall silent. Tom, it was Pedro, sliding into the seat across from him. You heard about the meeting tonight at the Union Hall. Thomas shook his head. What meeting? They're talking about fighting the closure, legal options, community pressure. Some of the guys think we can change their minds if we push back hard enough. Thomas sipped his coffee, which had grown cold. You believe that? Pedro hesitated. I want to. My cousin works at the Caterpillar plant in Aurora. They were scheduled to close in '95, but the union fought it, got politicians involved. Plant's still open. That's different. CAT is headquartered in Illinois. They care what happens here. GM is in Detroit. What do they care about Danville? Still, Pedro said, doing something feels better than doing nothing. Meetings at 7 if you want to come. Thomas nodded noncommittally. He doubted anything could change the decision. It had clearly been in the works for years, but Pedro was right about one thing. Action, even futile action, was better than passive acceptance. I'll think about it, he said, standing to go. I need to check with Olivia. But as he walked back to his station, Thomas knew he would attend. Not because he believed they could save the foundry, but because he needed to see how others were coping, needed to feel less alone in his disorientation, needed to be part of something, even if that something was just shared grief. The Union Hall was packed that night, men and a few women squeezed onto folding chairs, standing along walls, sitting on windowsills. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Thomas found a spot near the back, nodding to familiar faces. Frank was there, and Ernie and Ray. He didn't see Pedro, but the crowd was large enough that he could have missed him. At the front of the room, Union President Mike Townsend was speaking, his voice strained with emotion and hoarse from what seemed like hours of talking. Don't have to accept this lying down, he was saying. We have options. Legal options, political options, community options. GM signed agreements when they modernized in '89. Promised to maintain operations for at least 15 years in exchange for tax incentives from the city and state. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was news to most of them. We're 9 years into that 15-year commitment, Townsend continued. We've got documentation, we've got grounds for a lawsuit. So sue them, someone called out. Make them stick to the deal. Townsend held up his hands. It's not that simple. Lawsuits take time, years maybe. They've got armies of lawyers who will argue that market conditions constitute force majeure or some other legal bullshit to get them out of the contract. So what good is it then? Another voice demanded. Leverage, Townsend said. We use the threat of legal action, bad publicity, political pressure, all of it together to negotiate better terms, more severance, better pension protections, retraining funds, placement services. The crowd was divided, Thomas could see. Some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disgust. The pragmatists versus the fighters, those who accepted the inevitable and sought to cushion the landing versus those who believed they could still change the outcome. They're not going to change their minds about closing, Townsend said, his voice softening. I wish I could tell you different, but that ship has sailed. What we can do is make sure they don't leave us with nothing. Make sure they fulfill their obligations to the people who built this company with their sweat and blood. A man Thomas didn't recognize stood up in the front row. I've got 16 years in, he said, his voice breaking. 16 years of perfect attendance, never missed a day, never filed a grievance, did everything they asked, and this is how they repay loyalty, with a folder full of papers and a pat on the back. Townsend had no answer for that, and the room fell quiet, the collective grief palpable. Another man stood, older, maybe in his 60s. I remember when Central Foundry was something to be proud of, when people fought to get jobs here, when GM treated us like we mattered. Like we were part of something important, he shook his head. That's all gone now, it's just business to them, just numbers on a spreadsheet. Thomas felt these words like a physical blow. They articulated exactly what had been churning in his gut since the announcement. The sense of betrayal went beyond the practical concerns of lost income and benefits. It was about identity, about belonging, about purpose. For generations, the men of Danville had defined themselves by their work at the foundry, had drawn pride from being part of something solid and essential. Had believed their contribution mattered. Now they were being told, in effect, that they were interchangeable, replaceable, expendable. The meeting continued, Townsend outlining plans for community rallies, media outreach, letters to politicians. Thomas listened, but with growing detachment. The fight seemed both necessary and futile, like raging against a tsunami as it approached shore. You could shake your fist at the wave, but you couldn't stop it from crashing down. Afterward, Thomas found himself standing in the parking lot with Frank, neither quite ready to go home, both needing to process what they'd heard. You think any of it will make a difference? Frank asked, lighting a cigarette and offering the pack to Thomas, who declined with a shake of his head. The closure, no, better terms maybe. Townsend's right about that. They might give a little more to avoid the bad publicity. Frank exhaled smoke into the cold air. You know what kills me? My dad worked there 41 years. Retired with a gold watch, a decent pension, his dignity intact. He believed in GM, bought nothing but Chevys his whole life. I grew up thinking that's how it worked. You give your loyalty to a company, they take care of you. Thomas nodded. My dad was the same, 32 years, never missed a day, never complained. GM is family, he used to say. Some family, Frank took another drag, cuts you off without a second thought when you're no longer useful. They stood in silence for a moment, watching their breath form clouds in the February night. You taking the decommissioning job? Frank asked finally. Thomas sighed. Probably hard to turn down 6 more months of paychecks, you. I don't know, part of me says take the money. Part of me says I don't want to help them tear down what we built. Frank flicked his cigarette butt onto the slushy pavement. I've got a brother-in-law in Cincinnati, works for a company that makes industrial cooling systems. Says they might be hiring, I'm thinking about it. Cincinnati's not too far, Thomas said, though the idea of Frank leaving Danville, of the community dispersing, sent another pang through him. It wouldn't just be the foundry that disappeared, but the web of relationships built around it. The softball teams and bowling leagues, the Friday night beers after shift end, the carpools and birthday collections and Christmas parties. A whole social ecosystem collapsing. Olivia could probably find a teaching job there, Frank suggested. They need kindergarten teachers everywhere. Thomas nodded noncommittally. The thought of leaving Danville had occurred to him briefly. But this was home, his parents had been born here, he'd been born here, Tim had been born here, their roots went deep. And yet, what was left for them if the foundry closed? What future did Danville have without its industrial base? I should get home, Thomas said, suddenly weary. Let me know what you decide about Cincinnati. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. Will do, and hey, whatever happens, we had a good run, right? 26 years for you, 22 for me. That's something. Thomas managed a smile. Yeah, that's something. But as he drove home through the quiet streets of Danville, past darkened storefronts and empty parking lots, he couldn't help wondering, was it enough? The weekend arrived with fresh snow and bitter cold. Thomas spent Saturday morning going through the blue folder in detail, making notes, calculating numbers. The severance would carry them through December. The decommissioning job, if he took it, would extend that to summer '99. Their savings would last maybe 6 months beyond that. Then they'd be relying solely on Olivia's teaching salary, which covered the mortgage and utilities but not much else. He'd need to find work by this time next year at the latest, but what kind of work, where? Who would hire a 45-year-old former foundry worker? Olivia found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, a legal pad covered with calculations in front of him. You've been at this for hours, she said, setting a fresh cup of coffee beside him. Take a break, come help me clear the driveway. Thomas looked up, realizing the light had changed. It was past noon. Sorry, I lost track of time. Find any answers in those numbers? He shook his head, just more questions. Olivia sat across from him, her face serious but calm. I've been thinking, she said, about Tim's college. Thomas tensed. This was the question that kept him up at night, how to fulfill the promise they'd made to their son, how to give him the opportunity Thomas himself had missed. The first year is covered, Olivia continued. We've got enough saved. And with your severance, we can probably stretch to cover most of sophomore year too. After that, there's financial aid, loans if necessary. Tim can work summers. Thomas shook his head. I don't want him graduating with debt hanging over him. That's not the plan we made. Plans change, Tom, circumstances change. Tim understands that. He shouldn't have to understand it. This was my responsibility. To make sure he could focus on his education, not worry about paying for it. The frustration that had been building all week suddenly broke through. 26 years I've worked at that place. 26 years of showing up every day, doing everything they asked, believing if I just worked hard enough, was loyal enough, I'd be taken care of. And now what? All those promises, security, pension, college for Tim, just gone. Because some executives in Detroit decided our lives aren't worth protecting. Olivia reached across the table and took his hand. I know it's not fair, it's not right, but it's happening and we have to deal with it. I keep thinking about my dad, Thomas said, his voice softening. How proud he was when I got hired at the foundry, how sure he was that I was set for life. You're a GM man now, he told me, like it was joining the priesthood or something, a calling, an identity. You're more than your job, Tom. You always have been. Am I? He looked at her directly. What am I if not the provider, the foundry man? What's my value? Olivia's expression turned fierce. Thomas James Jacobsen, don't you dare talk like that. Your value has never been about your paycheck or where you work. It's about who you are, a man who loves his family fiercely, who has taught his son what integrity looks like. Who has been my partner and my best friend for 28 years. Thomas felt his eyes burning, looked down at their joined hands to hide it. I just don't know what comes next, he admitted. I can't see it. None of us can see the future, Olivia said gently, but I know you'll figure it out, we'll figure it out together. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Now come on, she said, standing and tugging his hand. The driveway isn't going to shovel itself and fresh air will do you good. Outside, the cold air was bracing, the physical labor of shoveling snow oddly satisfying. Tim joined them and they worked in companionable silence, clearing not just their own driveway but old Mrs. Henderson's next door. As they finished, Thomas looked up and down Woodlawn Avenue, at the neat houses with their smoking chimneys, at the children building snowmen in yards, at the Christmas decorations some families still hadn't taken down. This street, this neighborhood, had been his world for so long. The place where he'd taught Tim to ride a bike, where he and Olivia had planted a garden each spring, where they'd built a life one ordinary day at a time. He couldn't imagine leaving it. But he also couldn't imagine what it would become without the economic engine of the foundry powering the town. How many of these houses would stand empty in a year? How many neighbors would move away in search of work elsewhere? How many businesses would close when people had less to spend? "Dad," Tim was watching him, "you okay?" Thomas forced a smile. "Fine, just catching my breath." He clapped snow from his gloves. "Let's go in. I think we've earned some hot chocolate." That night, after Tim had gone to bed, Thomas sat in the living room, staring at the application form for the decommissioning team. Embry needed an answer by Monday. The logical choice was clear. 6 more months of work at his current salary plus a bonus at the end, time to figure out next steps. The practical path forward, but something in him still resisted, some stubborn pride perhaps, or deeper principle. Or simply grief that wasn't ready to transmute into pragmatism. Olivia came in from the kitchen, sat beside him on the couch, still deciding. He nodded. "My head says take it. It's 6 months of guaranteed income we didn't expect to have. But your heart disagrees." Thomas sighed. "Is it foolish to let feelings get in the way of practicality? We need the money." "It's human," Olivia said simply. "And whatever you decide, we'll make it work." He leaned his head back against the couch. 26 years live more than half my life. "I know," she rested her head on his shoulder. "Remember that first apartment on Seminary Street? How we could barely afford the rent, but we were so proud to have our own place." Thomas smiled at the memory. That kitchen was so small you couldn't open the refrigerator door all the way, had to slide food in sideways. And the heating was so bad we slept in sweatshirts and socks all winter. "I used to worry all the time," Thomas admitted, "about money, about being a good enough provider. About failing you and Tim." "You never failed us," Olivia said firmly, "not once. It feels like I'm failing now." She sat up to look at him. "This is not your failure. This is not about anything you did or didn't do. This is about forces bigger than any one person." Thomas nodded, though the reassurance felt hollow, logical but not visceral. His mind knew she was right, but his heart still felt the sting of inadequacy. "Whatever you decide about the decommissioning job," Olivia said, "I'm with you. If you need to walk away clean, we'll figure out the money somehow. If you decide to stay, I'll understand that too." Thomas looked at the form again, then set it aside. "I'll sleep on it," he said. "Maybe things will be clearer in the morning." But as he lay awake that night, listening to Olivia's steady breathing beside him, clarity remained elusive. The decision about the decommissioning job was just a stand-in for the larger question that loomed: what next? What identity would replace the one that had defined him for so long? What purpose would fill the void left when the foundry closed its doors for the last time? The answers wouldn't come tonight, perhaps they wouldn't come for months, but the questions themselves were changing him, forcing a re-examination of assumptions he'd held his entire adult life. About work, about worth, about what it meant to be a man, a provider, a success. Maybe that's what this crisis was really about, he thought as sleep finally began to claim him, not just the loss of a job but the beginning of a reckoning. A chance, unwelcome but perhaps necessary, to discover who Thomas Jacobsen might be beyond the identity he'd inherited and accepted without question for 26 years. The decommissioning team gathered in Conference Room B, 20 men who had accepted the offer to stay on past the June closure date. Thomas sat near the back, still not entirely comfortable with his decision. He'd turned in the form on Monday morning, telling himself it was the practical choice, the responsible one. 6 more months of paychecks, a bonus at the end, time to figure out what came next. But sitting here now, looking at the faces of the others who'd made the same choice, he recognized a complicated mix of emotions. Relief at the reprieve, yes, but also something that looked like shame. As if they'd made a deal with the executioner to help sharpen the axe. Charles Embry stood at the front of the room, flanked by 2 men Thomas didn't recognize. One was thin and bespectacled, with a tablet computer that seemed permanently attached to his hand. The other was older, heavyset, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime in factories. "Thank you all for agreeing to be part of this transition team," Embry began. Your experience and knowledge will be invaluable in ensuring an orderly decommissioning process. He gestured to the men beside him. This is David Chen from GM Technical Operations and Bill Mercer, who will be our decommissioning supervisor. They'll be working closely with all of you over the coming months. The thin man, Chen, stepped forward. First, let me thank each of you for your service to General Motors. The decision to close this facility was not made lightly, and we recognize the personal impact it has on all of you. Thomas felt a ripple of tension run through the room. Corporate platitudes, they'd heard enough of those. Our task now, Chen continued, seemingly oblivious to the reaction, is to carefully dismantle and relocate the usable equipment, properly dispose of materials, and prepare the building for potential future use. This is precision work that requires your expertise and institutional knowledge. Relocate to where? Someone asked from the front row. Thomas recognized Joe Dempsey's voice. 30 years in maintenance, knew every machine in the place inside out. Chen hesitated, glancing at Embry. Various GM facilities, he said vaguely. You mean Mexico, Joe pressed. Saltillo, right? That's where our jobs are going. Another uncomfortable pause. Some equipment will be transferred to our Saltillo facility, yes, Chen admitted. Other pieces will go to Saginaw or Bedford. Some will be sold or scrapped, depending on condition and compatibility with current operations. So we're teaching our replacements how to do our jobs, another voice called out. That what this is? The older man, Mercer, stepped forward now. Look, I understand how you feel. I've been through 4 plant closings in my career. It's never easy, but this is happening whether we like it or not. The question is, do we do it right with dignity and professionalism, or do we let outsiders who don't know the first thing about this operation come in and make a mess of it? This seemed to resonate more than Chen's corporate speak. Thomas saw heads nodding around the room. You men know these machines, Mercer continued. You've worked with them, maintained them, coaxed them through breakdowns and upgrades. You know their quirks, their capacities, their history. That knowledge has value, it deserves respect. Thomas found himself nodding along with the others. There was truth in what Mercer was saying. The machines they worked with weren't just interchangeable pieces of metal. They had personalities, idiosyncrasies that only became apparent after years of daily interaction. The way pouring Station 3 needed an extra few seconds to heat up in winter. The specific sound machine 17 made just before a belt was about to slip. The trick to getting the overhead crane in Bay 4 to move smoothly when it was fully loaded. This knowledge was a type of craftsmanship, accumulated through thousands of hours of observation and experience. It couldn't be written in a manual or taught in a classroom. It had to be transferred person to person, hand to hand. Over the next few weeks, Embry was saying, we'll be developing detailed decommissioning plans for each area of the plant. Bill will be meeting with each of you to draw on your expertise about the specific equipment you work with. The meeting continued, schedules being discussed, teams being formed, paperwork being distributed. Thomas listened with half an ear, his mind elsewhere. The foundry had been in operation since 1945. For 53 years, men had poured iron here, had transformed raw materials into the components that powered America's cars and trucks. That history deserved a proper ending, not a hasty dismantling by strangers who saw only metal and wire, not the human story embedded in every machine. Maybe that's why he'd agreed to stay on, Thomas realized. Not just for the money, though that mattered, but to be a witness. To ensure that the final chapter was written with care, with respect for what the foundry had meant to generations of Danville men. To make sure something of value was passed on, even as the physical plant was dismantled. It wasn't the ending he would have chosen, but if this was to be the foundry's eulogy, he wanted a hand in composing it. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the foundry to find Bill Mercer waiting for him at his workstation. The decommissioning supervisor had a clipboard and a digital camera and was studying the core assembly line with the intent look of someone who understood machinery intimately. Thomas Wright, Mercer extended a hand. Bill Mercer, got a few minutes to walk me through your operation here. Thomas nodded, feeling strange. The line was running as usual, they'd continue full production until the end of June, but now he was being asked to explain it as if it were already a historical artifact. Line B handles the cores for the 3.8-liter V6 engine blocks, Thomas began, falling into the technical language that was second nature after so many years. We use a cold box process with a phenolic urethane binder system. The sand comes in from those hoppers overhead, gets mixed with the resin and catalyst here, then gets blown into the core boxes. Mercer nodded, taking notes. And these core boxes, they're specific to this engine design. Yes, we've got different sets for each engine type we cast, the 3.8, the 3.4, the 4.3, and a few others. How many sets total? Thomas thought for a moment. 23 active sets plus maybe a dozen archived ones for engines we don't produce anymore but might need replacement parts for. Mercer whistled. That's a lot of tooling to track and transfer. All the documentation up to date. Thomas hesitated. The truth was, much of the knowledge about these core boxes existed not in manuals but in the collective experience of the men who worked with them daily. Which ones tended to stick in humid weather, which needed extra cleaning between uses, which had been modified over the years in ways that might not be reflected in the official drawings. Some of it's documented, he said carefully. Some of it's just known. Mercer smiled, understanding. That's why we need you guys. The paper trail only tells half the story, he gestured to the line. Walk me through the actual process. Pretend I'm the new guy you're training. For the next hour, Thomas did just that, explaining each step of the core making process in detail, how the mixed sand was blown into the core box, how gas was introduced to cure the binder, how the cores were extracted, inspected, assembled, the quality control checks, the common issues and their solutions. Mercer asked good questions, technical ones that revealed his own background in foundry work. He wasn't just a clipboard bureaucrat, he'd done this kind of work himself, understood the language and the challenges. You've been doing this how long? He asked as they wrapped up. 26 years, Thomas said, but the last 15 on this line specifically. It shows you know your stuff. Mercer made a final note, then tucked his pen behind his ear. Can I ask, you're not close to retirement age, I'm guessing. What's next for you after this place closes? The question caught Thomas off guard. Most people were tactful enough not to ask so directly. Still figuring that out, he said after a moment. My son's starting college in the fall, University of Illinois, so finding something that can help with that is the priority. Mercer nodded. Good school. Expensive, though. We've been saving and my wife teaches kindergarten, but yeah, it's going to be tight. You considered relocating. There's still foundry work out there if you know where to look. Not as much as there used to be, but companies that value experience can be found. Thomas shrugged. This is home, my wife's job is here, our house. He didn't add, my identity, my community, my entire adult life. I get it, Mercer said, just thought I'd mention it. I know some people in the industry if you ever change your mind. I appreciate that. Mercer checked his watch. I should get on to the next station, but I'll be back. Lots more to document before we start the actual decommissioning. Thomas nodded, watching him walk away. Then he turned back to his work, focusing on the familiar rhythm of the core assembly line, the sand flowing, the cores forming. The steady progression of parts that would eventually become engine blocks, powering vehicles across America. For how much longer, though? If the foundry work was moving to Mexico, would those Mexican-made engines be as reliable, as precisely crafted? Would the workers there develop the same intimate knowledge of the machinery, the same pride in their work? Or would it all become more automated, more anonymous, the human element reduced to pushing buttons and monitoring readouts? These questions occupied him through the rest of his shift, a shift that felt different now. Tinged with the awareness that each movement, each process he supervised was one less remaining. Like watching sand run through an hourglass, the future emptying into the past, grain by grain. Dad, Tim burst through the front door, waving a letter in his hand. It came, my financial aid package from U of I. Thomas looked up from the newspaper, where he'd been circling potential job openings, a daily ritual that had yielded little so far. Well, open it, he said, trying to match his son's enthusiasm despite the anxiety that immediately tightened his chest. This letter could determine whether their carefully constructed college plans would hold together or collapse. Tim tore open the envelope, scanning the contents rapidly. His expression shifted from excitement to confusion to disappointment. "It's not as much as we hoped," he said, his voice dropping. "Just the basic Pell Grant and a small scholarship, and they're offering loans for the rest." Olivia appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "How much in loans?" Tim handed her the letter. "About 15,000 for the first year." Thomas felt his heart sink. 15,000 in loans just for freshman year. Times 4 years, they'd be looking at 60,000 in debt by graduation. A crushing burden for a young person just starting out. "Let me see that," he said, taking the letter from Olivia. He scanned the figures, looking for something they'd missed, some other grant or scholarship that would make the numbers work. But there was nothing. Just the cold reality of college costs far outstripping their ability to pay. "We can appeal," Olivia said, always practical. "Write to the financial aid office, explain the situation with the foundry closing. Sometimes they have discretionary funds for special circumstances." Tim nodded, but his earlier excitement had evaporated. "Or I could just start at DACC," he said, referring to Danville Area Community College. "Do 2 years there, then transfer. It's a lot cheaper." Thomas looked at his son, tall, bright, full of potential. Tim had worked hard in high school, maintained a 3.8 GPA, been active in student government and the math team. He'd earned his spot at the state's flagship university. The idea of him settling for less because of circumstances beyond his control made Thomas's chest ache with a complicated mix of guilt, anger, and helplessness. "No," Thomas said firmly, "if U of I is where you want to be, that's where you'll go. We'll figure out the money." "Dad." "I mean it, Tim. You've done your part. You've worked hard, gotten the grades, been accepted. Now it's our job to make it happen." Olivia gave him a warning look, one that said, "Don't make promises we can't keep. We'll look at all the options," she said, moderating his absolute stance. "The appeal, maybe additional scholarships you can apply for, work-study programs on campus. There are always ways to make it work if we're creative." Tim looked between his parents, clearly sensing the tension. "I don't want you guys stressing about this. Seriously, DACC wouldn't be so bad. Lots of my friends are starting there." "Let's not decide anything tonight," Olivia said. "We'll sleep on it, make some calls tomorrow, see what our options are." Tim nodded, taking the letter back. "I'm gonna go call Jason, see what his package looks like." He headed upstairs, his steps heavy, the excitement of earlier completely gone. Once they were alone, Olivia turned to Thomas. "We need to be realistic," she said softly. "We can't afford 60,000 in loans on top of everything else. So he gives up his dream because GM decided we're disposable." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "That's not right, Liv. He deserves better." "Of course he does, but we have to work with reality, not what we think should be." She sat beside him on the couch. "Community college for 2 years isn't giving up, it's being strategic. He can still transfer to Illinois for his junior and senior years, still get the same degree, but at half the cost." Thomas knew she was right, the logic was irrefutable, but something in him rebelled against the compromise. Tim's college education had been the plan for so long, the goal that justified the years of physical toll at the foundry. The back pain, the hearing loss, the burns and cuts and chronic fatigue, all endured because it was leading somewhere. To his son, having opportunities Thomas himself had missed. "I'll figure something out," he said. "Maybe Mercer knows about jobs in the industry that pay better than what I'm seeing around here. Maybe we can take out a home equity loan." Olivia put her hand on his arm. "Tom, listen to me. Tim will be fine. Whether he starts at U of I or DACC, he'll get his education. He's smart, he's motivated, he has us supporting him. But we can't sacrifice our future to make his path exactly what we imagined. We're facing our own challenges now." Thomas nodded, knowing she was right but unable to fully accept it. The foundry closure had stolen more than just his job, it had stolen his ability to provide what he'd promised, to fulfill the vision he'd held for his family's future. "I'll talk to him," Olivia said. "Make sure he understands this isn't about him or what he deserves, it's just circumstances we're all adapting to." "No," Thomas said, "I'll talk to him, this should come from me." He found Tim in his bedroom, sitting at his desk, the financial aid letter spread out before him. Posters of Michael Jordan and the Illinois Fighting Illini basketball team covered his walls. On the bulletin board, a calendar marked with the orientation date for incoming freshmen. August 21, 1998. It had seemed so certain, so inevitable. "Hey," Thomas said, knocking on the open door frame. "Can we talk?" Tim turned, his expression carefully neutral. "If you're going to tell me it's okay to start at DACC, I already figured that out. It makes sense." Thomas came into the room, sat on the edge of the bed. "I want you to know something. When I was your age, I had plans to go to college too. Illinois State. I'd been accepted, was all set to go." Tim looked surprised. This wasn't a story Thomas had shared before. What happened? "Life happened. Your mom got pregnant with you, we got married, I needed a job right away, something stable with benefits. My dad got me on at the foundry." Thomas smiled, remembering. "I told myself it was temporary. Just until we got on our feet. Then 1 year turned into 5, turned into 10, turned into 26. "You regret it?" Tim asked quietly. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I regret not having options. Not having a backup plan when things changed. That's what education gives you: options, flexibility, the ability to adapt when the ground shifts beneath you." He gestured around them at the house, the life they'd built. "I've been lucky in many ways. I found work that was steady, that provided for us, but now they're taking it away," Tim finished for him. "Yeah, and I'm facing the reality that at 45, with no degree and skills specific to an industry that's disappearing, my options are limited. I don't want that for you. So you want me to go to U of I, even with the loans?" Thomas sighed. "What I want is for you to have choices, real ones, not just reactions to circumstances beyond your control. If DACC for 2 years, then transferring to Illinois makes the most financial sense, and you're okay with that path, then that's what we'll do. But don't choose it just because you feel guilty about the money. That's not your burden to carry." Tim was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Jason's parents are making him go to DACC, he said finally. "They say it's stupid to pay university prices for general education courses you can get anywhere." Thomas nodded. "There's wisdom in that. But Illinois has this engineering program I was really interested in. You can start at freshman year, special tracks and internships that are competitive to get into." "That does complicate things." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of inadequacy again. If the foundry weren't closing, if his income were secure, this wouldn't even be a question. "Let's do this. Your mom mentioned appealing the financial aid decision. Let's try that first, see if they'll offer more grant money given the circumstances. And you keep looking for scholarships. If we can get the loan amount down to something more reasonable, maybe we can make Illinois work from the start." Tim nodded, hope returning to his expression. "Okay. I'll start researching scholarships tonight." Thomas stood, feeling both lighter for having had the conversation and heavier with the responsibility it reinforced. "I'm proud of you, son. However this works out, I want you to know that." "Thanks, Dad," Tim hesitated, then added, "and I'm sorry about the foundry, I know it sucks." The simple acknowledgement, free of platitudes or attempts to fix the unfixable, hit Thomas unexpectedly hard. "Yeah," he managed, "it does suck." That night, lying awake beside Olivia's sleeping form, Thomas confronted a truth he'd been avoiding since the closure announcement. His work at the foundry had never just been about a paycheck. It had been about identity, about measuring his worth as a man, a provider, a father. The stability of that job had allowed him to see himself in a certain way: reliable, necessary, valuable. Now that stability was gone, and with it, the framework he'd used to understand his place in the world. The question wasn't just, "What will I do for work?" but the much more fundamental, "Who am I without this identity I've carried for 26 years?" The answer didn't come that night or the next. But the question itself marked a turning point, an acknowledgement that what he was losing went far deeper than a job or an income. It was a way of being, of understanding himself, that would need to be reconstructed from the ground up. April arrived with its characteristic Midwestern unpredictability: 70 degrees and sunny one day, sleeting the next. The foundry continued its operations at full capacity, filling orders that had been placed months ago before the closure announcement. But subtle changes were appearing. Equipment that broke down was patched rather than properly repaired. Inventory of raw materials was kept at minimum levels. The long-term planning meetings that had been a monthly fixture had simply stopped happening. Thomas continued his regular shifts in core assembly while also spending several hours each week with Bill Mercer, documenting equipment specifications, operational procedures, institutional knowledge that existed nowhere but in the minds of the workers. It was strange, bittersweet work, like writing your own obituary while still very much alive. "Tell me about this one," Mercer said, pointing to a massive core box mounted on line C. "The maintenance logs show it was modified in '92, but there's no documentation on what changes were made." Thomas examined the tooling, memory kicking in. "Yeah, we had issues with the water jacket cores sticking during extraction. Engineering designed a modification, added these small vents here and here to improve gas distribution during curing. Reduced our scrap rate by about 15%. Mercer made notes, then photographed the core box from several angles. "This kind of knowledge is gold," he said. "The drawings tell you how something was designed to work. Experience tells you how it actually works." Thomas nodded, feeling an unexpected pride. His experience did have value. The decades of accumulated knowledge about this specific equipment, these specific processes, represented a type of expertise that couldn't be easily replaced or replicated. Even as the company was discarding him, they needed what was in his head. "You ever think about teaching?" Mercer asked as they moved to the next station. "Technical colleges are always looking for instructors with real-world experience, especially in specialized fields like foundry work." The suggestion caught Thomas by surprise. "Teaching me? Why not? You explain things clearly. You understand both the theoretical and practical sides of the work. And you obviously care about doing things right." Thomas considered it. The idea had literally never occurred to him. Don't you need a degree to teach? For universities, yeah. But for technical colleges or community colleges, sometimes industry experience counts more, especially for hands-on courses. Something to think about anyway. It was something to think about. Thomas turned the idea over in his mind as he finished his shift and headed home. Teaching, passing on what he knew to the next generation. Not a concept that would have interested him even 6 months ago when he was focused solely on making it to his 30-year mark at the foundry. But now, with that future erased, new possibilities were taking shape in the void. He was still pondering it when he pulled into his driveway and saw Olivia's car already there. She didn't usually beat him home on Tuesdays. She had faculty meetings after school. The sight sent a small pulse of worry through him. Inside, he found her at the kitchen table, a letter spread out before her, her expression a mix of concern and resignation. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. She looked up. "The mortgage company denied our request for a home equity line of credit. They cited uncertain employment status as the reason." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. They'd applied for the line of credit as a safety net, a way to ensure they could cover Tim's tuition if other options fell through. The rejection was another door closing, another option eliminated. "They know I'm still employed through December," he said, sitting heavily in the chair across from her, "and you've been at the same school for 15 years. Apparently, that's not enough security for them. Not with the foundry closing and property values in Danville already dropping." She pushed the letter toward him. "We could try another bank, but I'm not optimistic." Thomas scanned the letter, anger building at the cold, bureaucratic language. The foundry closure was already creating ripple effects beyond the lost jobs. Local businesses were preparing for reduced consumer spending. Property values were declining as people anticipated a wave of homes going on the market as workers relocated for new jobs. Banks were tightening lending criteria, anticipating increased defaults. An entire community, destabilized by a decision made in a boardroom 1,000 miles away by people who would never have to face the consequences. "We'll figure something else out," he said, setting the letter aside. "Maybe a personal loan instead, or," he stopped, remembering his conversation with Mercer, "what would you think about me teaching? At a technical college or something?" Olivia looked surprised, then thoughtful. Teaching, you'd be good at that actually. You're patient, you explain things well, you know your field inside and out. Mercer mentioned it today. Said technical colleges often hire based on industry experience, not just degrees. That's true, DACC has several faculty members who came directly from industry. My friend Janet's husband teaches welding there. He worked at Hister for 20 years before they cut his division. Thomas felt a small spark of possibility ignite. I could look into it. See what the requirements are, what positions might be available. Olivia reached across the table, took his hand. I think you should. You have so much knowledge, Tom, not just about foundry work specifically, but about industrial processes, quality control, team management. That's valuable in an educational setting. The spark grew brighter. For the first time since the closure announcement, Thomas felt something like hope, not just for continued employment, but for a path that might actually use his experience in a meaningful way. Not just a job to pay bills, but work that could have purpose. I'll call DACC tomorrow, he said, see who I should talk to about opportunities. Olivia squeezed his hand. Good, and about Tim's school, we'll keep working on it. The financial aid appeal, scholarships, maybe student loans for just the first year until we get more stability. We've got options still. Thomas nodded, holding onto this new feeling, this tentative optimism that had appeared unexpectedly in the middle of what had felt like an unrelenting crisis. Maybe, just maybe, the end of one chapter could lead to the beginning of something worth writing. The DACC campus was smaller than Thomas had expected, a cluster of low-slung brick buildings on the east side of Danville. He'd driven past it hundreds of times over the years but had never had reason to visit. Now he parked in the visitor lot, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror before heading inside. He'd worn a button-down shirt and tie, not his usual attire, but he wanted to make a good impression. The meeting had been arranged through a connection of Mercer's, a former colleague who now headed the Industrial Technology Department at the college. Dr. Richard Saunders had agreed to meet with Thomas to discuss potential teaching opportunities, though he'd been clear on the phone that there were no current openings. We're always looking to build our pool of qualified adjunct instructors, though, he'd said, especially people with current industry experience. Thomas found the administration building and made his way to Saunders's office, a cluttered space filled with books, mechanical parts, and what appeared to be student projects in various stages of completion. Saunders himself was a lean, energetic man in his early 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a firm handshake. Thomas, good to meet you. Bill speaks highly of your expertise. Says you're one of the most knowledgeable core makers he's worked with. Thomas felt a flush of pride at the compliment. I appreciate that, I've been doing it a long time. 26 years at Central Foundry, he mentioned. That's a solid career, Saunders gestured to a chair. So the plant closes end of June, is that right? Yes, but I'm staying on through December for the decommissioning. Saunders nodded, smart move. Gives you time to plan your next steps. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk. So tell me, why teaching, what draws you to it? Thomas had anticipated the question and had prepared an answer, but now found himself speaking more honestly than he'd planned. Honestly, I never considered it until recently. My plan was to hit 30 years at the foundry, then maybe look at something less physically demanding for the last stretch before retirement. But now, he shrugged. Plans change. Indeed they do, Saunders agreed. But that doesn't really answer my question. Why teaching specifically? There are other options for a man with your skills. Thomas thought about it. I guess because I've always enjoyed the training aspect of my job. Breaking in new hires, explaining processes, troubleshooting problems. And now, working with Mercer, documenting all this knowledge that exists only in the heads of guys like me, it feels important. Like something that shouldn't be lost. Saunders smiled, seeming satisfied with this answer. That's the heart of teaching right there, not just conveying information but preserving and passing on knowledge that matters. Making sure it doesn't disappear. He pulled a folder from a stack on his desk. Now, as I mentioned on the phone, we don't have any full-time faculty positions open at present. But we do use adjunct instructors, part-time faculty who teach specific courses based on their expertise. He slid the folder across the desk. These are the courses in our industrial technology program that align with foundry and manufacturing experience. Take a look, see if any of them match your background. Thomas opened the folder, scanning the course descriptions: Introduction to Manufacturing Processes, Quality Control Systems, Industrial Safety, Materials Science and Testing. Each came with a brief overview of content and required qualifications. Most of these specify a bachelor's degree preferred, Thomas noted, feeling his hope dim slightly. Preferred, not required, Saunders emphasized. For technical courses, we can substitute significant industry experience for formal education. You'd need to document your expertise, of course, detailed work history, specialized training, certifications if you have them. I have some certifications. Quality control procedures, hazardous materials handling, that sort of thing. Good, those help. Saunders leaned back in his chair. The other factor is teaching experience. Have you done any formal training or instruction in your current role? Thomas thought about it. Not formally, no, but I've trained dozens of new hires over the years. And I've been the lead on my line for 15 years, which involves a lot of instruction and supervision. Saunders nodded. That's a start. We'd want to see how you handle a classroom setting, though. Perhaps observe you teaching a sample lesson before considering you for an actual course. Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness at the idea of standing in front of a classroom. It was one thing to explain a process to a new hire one-on-one, another entirely to formally teach a group of students. When would that happen? He asked. We could arrange it for summer if you're interested in pursuing this. Give you a specific topic, have you prepare a 45-minute lesson, deliver it to a small group of faculty and students. No pressure, just a chance for us to see your teaching style and for you to see if this is something you'd enjoy. Thomas nodded slowly. It was a reasonable step, though the thought of it made his palms sweat, and if that goes well. Then we'd add you to our pool of qualified adjuncts. When courses come available that match your expertise, you'd be contacted about teaching them. Most adjuncts start with one course per semester, which is about 3 to 4 hours of classroom time per week, plus preparation and grading. And the pay? Saunders named a figure that made Thomas wince internally. It was far less than he made at the foundry, even calculated hourly, not something he could live on, clearly. Most of our adjuncts have other primary employment, Saunders said, noting Thomas's reaction. Or they're retired or semi-retired. It's not intended to be a full-time income. I understand, Thomas said, trying to hide his disappointment. He'd known it was unlikely that teaching would completely replace his foundry income, but the reality was still sobering. Saunders seemed to sense his thoughts. Look, Thomas, I'll be straight with you. Adjunct teaching alone won't pay your mortgage, but it can be a foot in the door. If you prove yourself, if enrollment in these programs increases, and we're seeing more interest as other industries in the area contract, there's potential for more regular work. Maybe eventually a full-time position. Thomas nodded, recalibrating his expectations. Not an immediate solution then, but a potential path forward, something to build toward while he found other work to pay the bills in the meantime. I'd like to try the sample lesson, he said. See if it's something I can do, something I might enjoy. Saunders smiled. Excellent. I'll have my assistant contact you to set up a date. In the meantime, take that folder, review the course descriptions, think about which ones best match your experience, and start putting together a portfolio documenting your work history and qualifications. They shook hands, and Thomas left with the folder under his arm, feeling both encouraged and sobered. Teaching might offer a meaningful use of his experience, a way to preserve and pass on what he knew, but it wouldn't solve his immediate financial concerns once the foundry closed for good. As he drove home, Thomas found himself scanning the businesses along North Vermilion Street with new eyes: the equipment rental company, the auto parts stores, the manufacturing firms on the outskirts of town. Places that might value his mechanical knowledge, his understanding of industrial processes, his reliability. Places that might offer a paycheck while he explored this new potential path in education. For the first time, he was thinking not just about replacing what he was losing, but about creating something new, a patchwork career that might actually offer more variety and purpose than the job he'd held for 26 years, even if it came with less security. It wasn't what he would have chosen, but it was what he had, and he was beginning to see that it might not be all loss. June arrived with suffocating humidity and a palpable sense of countdown at the foundry. The official closing date, June 30th, loomed over every conversation, every task, every moment. Some workers had already found other jobs and left early, creating gaps in the production process that were filled haphazardly with reassignments and overtime. Others stayed but had mentally checked out, going through the motions with vacant expressions and minimal effort. Thomas tried to maintain his usual standards, both for pride's sake and because proper procedures were critical for safety. But it wasn't easy, watching the operation he'd been part of for so long begin to come apart like a sweater with a pulled thread. On June 25th, they poured the final castings. Thomas wasn't part of the pouring crew, but like many workers from other departments, he found his way to the pouring floor during his break to witness the end of an era. The massive ladles of molten iron, glowing orange in the dim light of the foundry floor. The practiced movements of the pouring team, men who had done this job so long they moved with the confidence and grace of dancers despite the extreme danger of their task. The distinctive smell, hot metal, sand, sweat, industrial lubricants that would forever remind Thomas of this place. As the last mold was filled, a spontaneous applause broke out among the gathered workers, then silence, heavy and significant. No speeches, no ceremony, just the collective recognition of an ending. Thomas returned to his station, his throat tight, unable to shake the feeling that he'd just witnessed a death, not just of a production line or a facility, but of something more profound. A way of life, a type of work that had defined not just individuals but entire communities for generations. The final day of operation, June 30th, 1998, dawned clear and hot. Thomas arrived for his shift at the usual time, 6:00 a.m., though there was little actual work to be done. Most of the day would be spent cleaning up, securing equipment, attending a company-sponsored lunch that was supposed to serve as both recognition and farewell. The mood was strange, a mix of grief, anger, resignation, and for some, a kind of giddy relief, as if a long-dreaded event had finally arrived and could now be faced rather than feared. Men who normally kept their emotions tightly controlled were openly tearful, embracing colleagues they'd worked alongside for decades. Others were stone-faced, determined to maintain dignity to the end. At noon, they gathered in the cafeteria for the farewell lunch. Catered food, far better than the usual cafeteria fare. Speeches from Charles Embry and representatives from GM Corporate. A slideshow of historical photos of the foundry, from its opening in 1945 to the present day. Thomas spotted his father in one of the older photos, standing with a group of workers beside a newly installed machine in what must have been the 1960s. Young, strong, proud, a version of the man Thomas had never known, his father before fatherhood, before responsibility had bent his shoulders and limited his horizons. After lunch, Thomas returned to his workstation one last time. The line was silent, the machine still. He ran his hand along the control panel he'd operated for 15 years, feeling the worn spots where thousands of touches had smoothed the metal. "Hard to believe it's over," said Ernie, appearing beside him. 43 years this place has been running and tomorrow nothing. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "You staying for the decommissioning?" Ernie asked. "Yeah." "You?" Ernie shook his head. "Couldn't do it, couldn't help them tear it down. Besides, my brother-in-law got me on at the warehouse in Tilton. Not great money, but it's something." "That's good," Thomas said. "Glad you found something. You figured out what you're doing after December." Thomas thought of his meeting with Dr. Saunders, the teaching demonstration he was scheduled to give in July. "Working on some possibilities," he said vaguely, "nothing solid yet." Ernie clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll land on your feet, Tom." "You always do." He glanced at his watch. "I'm gonna head out, got all my paperwork signed already. No point dragging it out, you know." They shook hands, promised to stay in touch, both knowing the likelihood of that was slim. Then Ernie was gone, and Thomas was alone with the silent machines that had been the backdrop of his working life for so long. At 3:30 p.m., he clocked out for the last time as a foundry worker. The time clock, a mechanical punch system that had been in use since before Thomas started, would itself be removed in the coming weeks, replaced by a digital system for the decommissioning team. Another piece of history disappearing. In the parking lot, men were saying their goodbyes, exchanging phone numbers, making vague plans to meet for beers or barbecues that might or might not materialize. Thomas recognized the forced optimism in their voices, the determination to believe this wasn't really the end of their connection. But he'd seen it before when his father's colleagues had retired or moved on. Work relationships rarely survived the absence of daily proximity and shared purpose. He got into his car and sat for a moment, looking at the foundry buildings through the windshield, the tall brick walls, the smokestacks now silent. The loading docks where trucks had once queued to carry their products across the country. It had seemed so permanent, so enduring. Now it was just another closed factory, soon to be an empty shell, eventually perhaps to be repurposed or demolished, erasing the physical evidence that thousands of men had once earned their living here, had defined themselves by the work they did within these walls. Thomas started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, glancing in his rearview mirror at the foundry receding behind him. The past growing smaller with each passing day, whether he was ready to let it go or not. The teaching demonstration was scheduled for July 15th at DACC. Thomas had been preparing for weeks, researching, organizing notes, even practicing in front of Olivia and Tim, who offered encouragement and constructive criticism. The topic Dr. Saunders had assigned him was quality control in manufacturing processes, a subject Thomas knew intimately from his years at the foundry. Still, as he pulled into the college parking lot that morning, his stomach churned with nervousness. This was so far outside his comfort zone. Standing up in front of strangers, presenting himself as an authority, being evaluated on his ability to communicate rather than his ability to work with his hands, it was a fundamental shift in how he defined his value. He dressed carefully, slacks, a pressed shirt, a tie Olivia had helped him select, professional but not too formal. He carried a folder with his notes and a USB drive containing the PowerPoint presentation he'd created with Tim's help. Everything prepared, everything in order, yet he still felt like an imposter, a foundry worker playing dress-up as an instructor. Dr. Saunders met him in the lobby of the Industrial Technology Building. "Thomas, good to see you. All set for today?" Thomas nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "As ready as I'll ever be." "That's the spirit. We've got a small group waiting, 3 faculty members from the department and 2 students who volunteered to participate. Just 45 minutes, then a few minutes for questions. Nothing too intimidating." Nothing too intimidating, right, just the entire direction of his future professional life potentially hanging in the balance. The classroom was small, with tables arranged in a U-shape facing a whiteboard and projection screen. The 5 observers were already seated, looking at him with neutral expressions as he entered. Saunders made brief introductions, then gestured for Thomas to begin whenever he was ready. Thomas took a deep breath, set up his presentation on the computer, and launched into his introduction. His voice shook slightly at first, but as he moved into the substance of the lesson, explaining the principles of quality control, giving concrete examples from his experience, demonstrating how small variations in process could lead to significant differences in outcomes, he found his rhythm. These were things he knew, things he'd lived every day for decades. The expertise flowed naturally, and he found himself relaxing, even enjoying the process of sharing what he knew, of seeing understanding dawn in the eyes of the student volunteers when he explained a complex concept in accessible terms. Before he knew it, the 45 minutes had elapsed, and Saunders was signaling that it was time for questions. These were thoughtful, probing, about specific techniques, about how principles applied across different industries, about how he would handle certain teaching scenarios. Thomas answered honestly, drawing on his experience where he could, admitting when a question fell outside his area of expertise. And then it was over. The observers thanked him, gathered their notes, and filed out, leaving Thomas alone with Saunders. "Well done," the department chair said, smiling. "Very well done. You have a natural teaching ability, Thomas. You explain complex ideas clearly, you use concrete examples effectively, and you've got an authentic authority that comes from real experience." Thomas felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, I was pretty nervous at first." "Couldn't tell," Saunders assured him. A little nervousness at the start is normal, even for experienced instructors. But you settled in quickly, he gathered his own notes. I'll be honest, I think you'd be an excellent addition to our adjunct faculty. Your knowledge is current, practical, and you communicate it well. The question isn't if we'd like to have you teach, but when and what. Thomas felt a surge of pride and possibility. So what happens next? We finalize your paperwork, add you to our pool of qualified instructors. As I mentioned before, we don't have any immediate openings for fall semester, those were assigned months ago. But things change, courses get added based on enrollment, instructors have emergencies or conflicts. And we're already planning for spring semester. It wasn't immediate employment, but it was a door opening, a path forming. I appreciate the opportunity, Thomas said, even if it's not right away. Actually, Saunders said, there is one immediate possibility, though it's not a regular course. He hesitated, as if considering whether to bring it up. We've been approached by the Vermilion County Economic Development Commission about offering specialized training for workers affected by the foundry closure and other recent layoffs. Short workshops focusing on transferable skills, career transitions, that sort of thing. Thomas nodded, familiar with the concept. The blue folder from GM had mentioned similar resources. They're looking for instructors who understand both the technical aspects and the human side of industrial work, Saunders continued. People who can help others identify their transferable skills, prepare for interviews in new industries, that sort of thing. Someone like you, who's going through the transition personally, might be particularly effective, interested. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Teaching others how to navigate a transition he was still struggling with himself. But there was something appealing about the idea of helping his former colleagues, of using his own experience to make their paths a little easier. I'd be interested, he said, though I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach about career transitions when I'm still figuring out my own. Saunders smiled. Sometimes the best teachers are just a few steps ahead of their students, Thomas. You're thoughtful, articulate, and you have credibility with this population. They'll listen to you in a way they might not listen to someone with a fancy degree but no real experience in their world. It made sense. And it would be a way to maintain connection with the community he'd been part of for so long, even as that community itself was dispersing. Let me talk to the Development Commission, Saunders said. See what the specifics would be, schedule, compensation, curriculum. Then we can talk again if you're still interested. Thomas nodded, grateful for the opportunity, but also clear-eyed about its limitations. This wouldn't be a full-time job or a complete solution to his employment needs, but it could be a beginning, a first step into a new professional identity. As he drove home, he felt a strange mix of emotions, pride in having done well at something completely new, excitement about potential opportunities, anxiety about the still uncertain future. But underlying it all was a quiet realization: he was more than a foundry worker. His value wasn't limited to what he could produce with his hands. He had knowledge, experience, perspective that could be valuable in entirely different contexts. The identity he'd carried for 26 years wasn't the only one available to him. There were other possibilities, other ways to contribute, other sources of meaning and purpose. The path forward was still unclear, but for the first time since the closure announcement, Thomas felt like he was moving towards something, not just away from what had been lost. The workshops began in August, held in a conference room at the Economic Development Commission's offices downtown. 2 evenings a week, 3 hours each session for 6 weeks. The pay was modest but welcome, a supplement to Thomas's income from the decommissioning work which continued during the day. The curriculum covered practical topics: identifying transferable skills, updating resumes, preparing for interviews, networking, researching potential employers. Thomas co-taught with a career counselor named Marion, who brought formal expertise in job searching while he provided the industry perspective and credibility with the participants, all former industrial workers, many from the foundry. That first evening, walking into the room to face 15 men he'd worked alongside for years, now sitting at tables with notepads and wary expressions, Thomas felt the weight of their shared experience. These were proud men, skilled craftsmen, providers for their families. Men who had defined themselves by their ability to do difficult, necessary work that others couldn't or wouldn't do. Men for whom asking for help, admitting vulnerability, acknowledging confusion about what came next, these things didn't come naturally. Evening, Thomas began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. I know this isn't where any of us planned to be in August of 1998. I know it feels strange, sitting in a classroom instead of standing on a shop floor. Believe me, I feel it too. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each participant. Frank was there, and Pedro and several others he knew well. Some nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of his words. But here we are, Thomas continued, and we have choices to make. We can focus on what's been taken from us, or we can focus on what comes next. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers. I'm figuring this out alongside you. But I do know this: what we did at the foundry required skill, intelligence, problem-solving, attention to detail. Those qualities don't disappear when a plant closes. They're still valuable, still needed, just in different contexts. As the session progressed, Thomas found that his own experience, his own questions, concerns, moments of both doubt and insight, became his most effective teaching tool. He could anticipate their objections because they were often his own. He could validate their frustrations because he shared them. He could offer perspective that felt authentic because it came from someone in the same situation, not from an outsider looking in. By the end of the first workshop, Thomas felt both drained and energized. This wasn't like his work at the foundry with its clear procedures and tangible outputs. Success here was harder to measure, progress less visible. But there was something deeply satisfying about using his own difficult experience to potentially ease the path for others. As the weeks passed, he saw small but significant changes in the participants. Men who had initially been reluctant to speak began sharing their experiences, their fears, their small victories in the job search process. They brought in resumes for feedback, practiced interview responses, exchanged leads on potential opportunities. A community was forming, not the same as what they'd had at the foundry, but something new, built on shared challenges and mutual support. For Thomas, the workshops provided something he hadn't anticipated: a new lens through which to view his own transition. The very act of helping others identify their transferable skills forced him to recognize his own more clearly. The process of teaching about adaptation and resilience required him to embody those qualities himself. The role of instructor pushed him to articulate insights he might otherwise have left unexamined. By the final session in mid-September, several participants had found new employment, not always at comparable wages or with equivalent benefits, but work that used their skills and provided income. Others had enrolled in training programs for specific certifications that would open doors in growing industries. A few were considering relocation to areas with stronger manufacturing sectors. All had moved forward in some way from the shock and disorientation of the closure. After the last workshop ended, Frank lingered, helping Thomas gather materials and straighten the room. "Never thought I'd see you up there teaching, Tom," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You're good at it." Thomas smiled, still not entirely comfortable with the compliment, but beginning to accept it. "Different from what I expected to be doing, that's for sure." "Life's full of surprises, ain't it? Some good, some not so good." Frank leaned against a table. "Got a job offer yesterday. That company in Cincinnati my brother-in-law works for. They want me to start next month." "That's great, Frank. Good pay." "Not quite what I made at the foundry, but close enough. Benefits are decent. And Cincinnati's growing, not shrinking like Danville. More opportunities for the kids." He hesitated. "Carol's not thrilled about moving, leaving her family and all, but she sees the writing on the wall here." Thomas nodded, understanding all too well. Danville had lost not just the foundry but Hister's forklift plant, significant portions of its healthcare industry, and numerous smaller manufacturers and suppliers over the past decade. The economic landscape was changing, and not in ways that favored towns built around traditional manufacturing. When would you go? October 15th is the start date. We're putting the house on the market next week. Frank looked around the empty conference room. "Never thought I'd leave Danville, born and raised here just like you, but sometimes you gotta go where the work is, you know." "I know," Thomas said, though the thought of his own potential relocation remained abstract, theoretical. Olivia's job was secure, at least for now. Tim was at DACC, having decided to complete his associate's degree locally before transferring to Illinois for his junior and senior years. Their roots were deep here, but so had Frank's been. "You should consider it too, Tom," Frank said, as if reading his thoughts. "There's more out there than what's left here." Thomas nodded noncommittally. "One day at a time, that's all I can manage right now." As they walked out together into the September evening, the conversation turned to the decommissioning work, which continued at the foundry. Most of the equipment was now being dismantled, crated for shipping to other facilities. The buildings themselves would be emptied completely by year's end, then likely sold or demolished, erasing the physical presence that had been a landmark in Danville for over 50 years. "You know what's weird?" Frank said as they reached their cars. "I drive by the place now and it already looks different. The smokestacks aren't smoking anymore, the parking lot's mostly empty. It's like watching something die in slow motion." Thomas understood exactly what he meant. Each day, the foundry became less recognizable, less like the place that had been at the center of their working lives for so long. The massive pouring vessels were gone, shipped to Saltillo. The core-making equipment Thomas had operated for 15 years had been carefully dismantled and was awaiting transport. The distinctive sounds and smells that had defined the space were fading, replaced by the whine of cutting torches and the dust of demolition. It was always going to end someday, Thomas said, just not like this. "Not all at once." Frank nodded. "Well, I'll see you tomorrow. Last few weeks of decommissioning for me, then on to Cincinnati." "We'll miss you around here," Thomas said, meaning it despite knowing their friendship had always been context-specific, limited to work and occasional social gatherings connected to the foundry. Without that shared environment, it was unlikely they'd maintain much contact, especially with Frank relocating, another loss to add to the growing list. As he drove home, Thomas reflected on the changes of the past 7 months. The closure announcement that had felt like the end of the world. The scramble to understand options, to secure what could be secured, to plan for an uncertain future. The slow, painful process of dismantling not just a physical workplace but an entire way of life. And yet, alongside the losses, there had been unexpected developments. The teaching opportunity, the workshops, the discovery that his knowledge and experience had value beyond the specific context where they'd been developed. The realization that while one door had closed, decisively, permanently, others were opening if he was willing to step through them. It wasn't what he would have chosen. The uncertainty still gnawed at him, especially regarding long-term employment and financial stability. But he was beginning to see that the closure, devastating as it was, had also created space for possibilities that might never have been explored otherwise. Had forced him to reconsider assumptions about identity and worth that had gone unexamined for decades. The path forward was still unclear, but Thomas was no longer standing still, paralyzed by the loss of what had been. He was moving, however tentatively, toward what might be next. December 23, 1998. The final day of decommissioning at the Central Foundry Division. Thomas stood in what had once been the main production floor, now an empty expanse of concrete, echoing with the footsteps of the skeleton crew that remained to complete the shutdown. The dismantling was complete. Equipment had been shipped to other facilities or sold for scrap. Systems had been deactivated, utilities disconnected. All that remained was a final walkthrough, signing off on the paperwork that would officially transfer the property from active industrial site to vacant real estate. Bill Mercer appeared at Thomas's side, clipboard in hand. "Almost done," he said. "Just need signatures on the final inspection forms, then we can all go home for Christmas." Thomas nodded, following Mercer through the cavernous space. It was strange seeing it so empty, so silent. For decades, this floor had hummed with activity, filled with machinery and men working in carefully choreographed patterns to transform raw materials into precision components. Now it was just a shell, waiting for whatever came next. "Any word on what happens to the building?" Thomas asked as they walked. Mercer shrugged. "GM will try to sell it, but large industrial sites like this are tough to move these days, especially in smaller markets. Might sit empty for years. Might get demolished eventually if no buyer steps up." The thought of demolition, of erasing even the physical evidence of what had happened here, sent a pang through Thomas, but he pushed it aside. Nostalgia wouldn't pay bills or create new opportunities for Danville. What about you? He asked. Where do you go after this? Detroit for a couple weeks to file final reports. Then there's a plant in Ontario that's restructuring, not closing but significant changes. I'll be there for probably 6 months. Mercer glanced at him. And you, any clearer picture on what's next? Thomas hesitated, then decided there was no harm in sharing. Got a call from Dr. Saunders at DACC yesterday. They've approved me to teach 2 courses for spring semester. Industrial Safety and Introduction to Manufacturing Processes, part-time but it's something. Mercer smiled. That's great news. I thought you had real potential there. The way you documented processes for us, explained complexities, that's valuable in a classroom. It's still strange to think about, Thomas admitted. Standing in front of students instead of operating machinery, wearing a tie instead of safety gear, being evaluated on how well I communicate instead of how much I produce. Change is always strange at first, Mercer said. But you adapt, find new rhythms, new satisfactions. He paused at what had been the main control station, now just an empty metal desk. Anything else in the works? Teaching alone probably won't cover all the bills. Applied for a position at Allied Industrial Supply, Thomas said. They need someone with manufacturing knowledge to work with clients, help them find the right equipment and materials. Interview went well, should hear something after the holidays. Sales, Mercer nodded. That could be a good fit. You know the products, understand the customer's perspective, plus you've got credibility, you've actually used the stuff you'd be selling. They continued the walkthrough, checking items off Mercer's list. In each area, memories surfaced for Thomas. The lunch table where he'd sat with the same group of men for 15 years. The time clock where he'd punched in and out more than 12,000 times over his career. The spot where he'd slipped on an oil spill in '87 and wrenched his back, an injury that still flared up in cold weather. This place had been more than just a workplace. It had been the backdrop for a significant portion of his life story. The setting where he'd evolved from an uncertain 19-year-old into a skilled craftsman, a respected lead, a man who knew his value and his purpose. And now it was empty, just walls and floors and high ceilings, the machinery gone, the people scattered, the purpose evaporated. Last item, Mercer said, stopping at the main entrance. Final sign-off on completed decommissioning. He held out the clipboard and Thomas added his signature to the form, the final official act of his 26-year career at Central Foundry. And that's it, Mercer said, checking his watch. 3:17 p.m. December 23, 1998, Central Foundry Division, Danville, Illinois, officially closed. They stood for a moment in silence, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then Mercer extended his hand. It's been a pleasure working with you, Thomas. You're one of the good ones. I hope our paths cross again someday. Thomas shook his hand firmly. Same here. And thank you for the teaching suggestion, for the recommendation to Saunders. It's opened up possibilities I wouldn't have considered on my own. They walked out together into the crisp December afternoon. The parking lot, once filled with hundreds of cars, now held just a handful. Mercer's rental, Thomas's caprice, a few vehicles belonging to the remaining security personnel who would oversee the vacant property. Thomas paused beside his car, looking back at the foundry one last time. The brick buildings with their tall windows, the smokestacks, now cold and dormant, the loading docks where countless shipments had come and gone. For 53 years, this place had been the economic heart of Danville, providing not just jobs but identity, purpose, community. Now it was just another closed factory in America's industrial heartland. Another casualty of changing markets, global competition, corporate calculations that measured value solely in terms of profit and shareholder returns. "You okay to drive?" Mercer asked, noting Thomas's pensive expression. Thomas nodded, just saying goodbye, I guess. Mercer understood. Take care, Thomas. Good luck with the teaching, with everything. You too, Bill. Thomas got into his car and started the engine, adjusting the heat against the December chill. Then he pulled out of the parking lot for the final time, glancing in his rearview mirror as the foundry receded behind him. The past growing smaller, the future still taking shape ahead. As he drove through Danville toward home, he noticed details he might once have overlooked. The for sale signs in front of houses that hadn't sold in months, the empty storefronts downtown. But also signs of adaptation, a former department store now housing a community college satellite campus. A shuttered restaurant reopened as a daycare center, a vacant lot transformed into a small park. Danville was changing just as he was, painfully, reluctantly, but inevitably. The old certainties were gone, the assumptions about what constituted success, security, purpose all up for reconsideration. At home, Olivia was waiting, her car in the driveway, lights glowing warmly in the early winter darkness. She'd taken the day off from teaching to be there when he finished his final shift. As he pulled in beside her car, the front door opened and she stood framed in the doorway, a beacon of continuity in a landscape of change. "How was it?" she asked as he came up the walk. "Strange." "Empty," he kissed her cheek as he stepped inside. "But it's done now." "Tim called from his friend's house," she said, taking his coat. "Wanted to know if we should pick up Chinese for dinner to celebrate your last day." Thomas smiled at the thought. His son's perspective that the end of something difficult could be cause for celebration rather than just mourning was refreshingly uncomplicated. "Sounds good to me." In the kitchen, a small envelope sat on the table, addressed to Thomas in unfamiliar handwriting. "This came for you today," Olivia said, "from Allied Industrial Supply." Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness as he opened it. The interview had gone well, he thought, but in this job market, with so many experienced workers competing for limited openings, nothing was certain. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dear Mr. Jacobsen, we are pleased to offer you the position of Technical Sales Representative at Allied Industrial Supply, effective January 11, 1999. Relief washed over him, followed by a cautious optimism he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. The salary wasn't quite what he'd made at the foundry, but combined with the teaching income and what remained of his severance, they'd be okay. Not flush but stable, able to meet their obligations, support Tim's education, maintain their home. "Good news?" Olivia asked, watching his expression. He handed her the letter. "They offered me the job. Starting January 11th. Her face lit up as she read. "Tom, this is wonderful, and with the teaching position, this could actually work out better than we feared." "Different," he said, "not what I expected. But maybe better in some ways." He meant it. The sales position would use his technical knowledge but add new skills, new challenges. The teaching would allow him to pass on what he knew, to find meaning beyond production quotas and output metrics. Neither role alone would have been enough, but together they created a new professional identity that felt surprisingly right. "I'm proud of you," Olivia said, setting the letter down. "This hasn't been easy. The uncertainty, the stress, the whole identity question, but you've handled it with grace." Thomas wasn't sure about that. There had been plenty of moments of anger, despair, resentment. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what would become of them. Days when the effort of presenting a confident face to Tim and others had drained him completely, but he had moved forward. Had considered options he might never have explored if the foundry had remained open. Had discovered capacities within himself that decades of routine work had left dormant. "We're going to be okay," he said, and for the first time in months he truly believed it. Not just financially, though that mattered enormously, but in the deeper sense of finding purpose, meaning, identity beyond the narrowly defined role he'd occupied for so long. The loss was still real. The foundry closure had taken something precious from him, from all the workers who had defined themselves by their place in that industrial ecosystem. The community that had formed around shared work, shared challenges, shared pride in making something essential that couldn't be fully replaced. But as he stood in his kitchen, Olivia's hand in his, the letter of employment on the table before them, Thomas realized that what remained was still substantial. His capacity to learn, to adapt, to find new ways of contributing. His family's love and support, his own resilience tested and proven through this long year of uncertainty. The foundry was gone, but he was still here, still capable, still valuable, still becoming whatever came next. Epilogue, June 2018. The graduation ceremony was held in the auditorium of the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, a cavernous space filled with proud families watching their children cross the stage to receive master's degrees. Thomas and Olivia sat near the front, thanks to Tim's role as a faculty member in the engineering department. Professor Tim Jacobsen, Olivia whispered, squeezing Thomas's hand. I still can't quite believe it. Thomas nodded, his chest tight with pride. Their son had indeed started at DACC back in 1998, completed his associate's degree with honors, then transferred to Illinois for his bachelor's in mechanical engineering. After working in industry for several years, he'd returned for his PhD and now taught and conducted research at his alma mater. On stage, Tim was calling graduates names, shaking hands, offering congratulations. At 37, he looked so much like Thomas had at that age, the same build, the same confident stance, but his path had been different, broader, filled with options that Thomas's generation had often lacked. He gets it from you, you know, Olivia said, reading his thoughts as she often did after nearly 40 years of marriage. The teaching. The way he explains complex ideas makes them accessible, that's your influence. Thomas smiled. It was a nice thought, though he suspected Tim's teaching style owed more to natural ability and formal training than to his father's example. Still, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing his son thrive in academia, a world Thomas himself had entered late and partially, but had found unexpectedly rewarding. He'd taught at DACC for 15 years as an adjunct instructor, juggling evening classes with his day job at Allied Industrial Supply, where he'd eventually become regional sales manager before retiring in 2015. The dual career had been challenging but fulfilling, using different aspects of his knowledge and personality, keeping him engaged and learning long after many of his former foundry colleagues had settled into less satisfying routines. Now, at 65, he was fully retired, though he still occasionally guest lectured at DACC when they needed someone with historical knowledge of manufacturing processes that were rapidly becoming obsolete in the age of automation and advanced materials. After the ceremony, they met Tim outside the auditorium, surrounded by students offering thanks and goodbyes as the academic year concluded. He broke away when he saw them, embracing each in turn. Great ceremony, Thomas said. You looked right at home up there, Professor. Tim grinned. Still feels strange sometimes. Half the time I'm waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder and say there's been a mistake, I don't really belong here. Imposter syndrome, Olivia said. Even after all your accomplishments. Maybe especially after them, Tim checked his watch. We've got reservations at Silver Creek at 7, should we head over? I'm starving. They walked to the restaurant together through the early summer evening, the campus lively with students celebrating the end of the academic year. Thomas found himself thinking of that long-ago summer of 1998, when the foundry had closed and the future had seemed so uncertain. How could he have imagined then that 20 years later he'd be here, retired from 2 successful careers, watching his son thrive as a university professor? At the restaurant, after they'd ordered and were sipping drinks, Tim turned the conversation to Danville. I drove through last weekend, he said, went by the old foundry site. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. Tim had always been interested in the history, the story of the place that had shaped his father's life and indirectly his own. Still empty. No, that's just it, they're finally developing it. Some tech company from Chicago bought the property, they're converting it into a data center, all those old buildings repurposed for server farms. After 20 years sitting vacant, Olivia marveled. I never thought I'd see it used again. Signs of the times, Thomas said. From manufacturing physical components to storing digital data, that's America's industrial evolution in a nutshell. Tim nodded. The project manager I spoke with said they chose the site specifically because of the existing infrastructure, the power capacity, the concrete foundations built to support heavy machinery. The bones of the old industrial economy supporting the new digital one. There was something poetic in that, Thomas thought, a continuity amid the change. The physical legacy of what had been built by generations of foundry workers, now serving a purpose they could never have imagined. What about the rest of Danville? He asked. How's it looking? Tim's expression grew more somber. Mixed, downtown is still struggling, lots of empty storefronts, but there are bright spots. That arts center in the old courthouse seems to be doing well, and DACC has expanded their campus. taking over more of those vacant commercial buildings, converting them to classrooms and labs. Thomas nodded, unsurprised by the report. Danville, like many small industrial cities across America, had been fundamentally changed by the loss of its manufacturing base. Some had found ways to reinvent themselves around education, healthcare, tourism, technology. Others continued to struggle, seeking a new identity, a new economic purpose. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Tim asked. "Moving to Champaign when Mom got the job at the elementary school here." Thomas considered the question. They'd relocated in 2005 when Olivia had been offered a position as curriculum coordinator for the Champaign School District, a significant promotion from her teaching role in Danville. By then, their ties to Danville had loosened. Tim was already at University of Illinois. Their house had finally sold after 3 years on the market. Many friends had moved away following the wave of industrial closures. The decision had been practical, logical. "I miss what it was," Thomas said finally. "The community we had there when you were growing up, the sense of place, of belonging, but that was already changing before we left." Once the foundry closed, once Hister cut back, once the hospital downsized, the Danville we knew was already fading. Olivia nodded in agreement. The hardest part was selling the house for so much less than it was worth. All that equity we thought we were building, just gone. "Another casualty of deindustrialization," Tim said, the academic in him emerging. "The hidden costs that don't show up in corporate calculations when plants close. Property values, tax base, community cohesion, psychological impacts." Thomas smiled at his son's analysis, accurate but somewhat detached, viewing as a socio-economic phenomenon what Thomas and his generation had experienced as personal upheaval. The professor's perspective versus the workers. "It worked out better than it might have," Thomas said, bringing the conversation back to lived experience. "The teaching opportunity, the sales job, those wouldn't have happened if the foundry had stayed open. I'd have worked there until retirement, probably. Never tried anything new. Never discovered those other aspects of myself." "Necessity as the mother of reinvention," Tim said, raising his glass, "to adaptability." They clinked glasses and Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for where life had taken them, despite, or perhaps because of, the disruptions along the way. The foundry closure had been a profound loss, yes, a violation of the implicit contract between company and workers, community and industry. The pain of that breach had been real and lasting. But it had also created space for new possibilities, new identities, new understandings of value and purpose. Had forced a reconsideration of assumptions that might otherwise have gone unexamined for a lifetime. As they continued their dinner, conversation turning to other topics, Tim's research, Olivia's volunteer work with literacy programs, plans for a family vacation, Thomas found himself reflecting on the long arc from that February day in 1998 when the closure had been announced to this moment, 20 years later. The foundry was gone. Many of the men he'd worked alongside had dispersed, to other towns, other industries, retirement, in some cases early graves as stress and disruption took their toll. The community that had formed around shared work had dissolved, impossible to maintain without the daily proximity and common purpose that had sustained it. But something had endured, something had been passed on. Not just in the repurposed buildings that would soon house servers instead of pouring lines. Not just in the teaching Thomas had done, transmitting his knowledge to younger generations entering different industries. But in the more fundamental lesson about adaptation, about finding identity and worth beyond a single role or function, about building a life that could withstand the winds of economic change. This, Thomas realized, was perhaps his most significant legacy. Not the engine blocks he'd helped produce over 26 years at the foundry, most now melted down or rusting in junkyards. But the example he'd set for his son of resilience, of willingness to reinvent himself when circumstances demanded it, of finding dignity and purpose even when the ground shifted beneath his feet. "You're quiet, Dad," Tim observed, breaking into his thoughts. "Everything okay?" Thomas smiled, returning to the present moment. "Everything's fine, just thinking about journeys, how we never really know where they'll lead when we start out."